Before we get started, there will be spoilers for the remainder of the 1000-Year Blood War arc of Bleach in the video to follow. Why are you guys doing this to me? Pitting two of my absolute favourite characters against each other is just a cruel exercise, an unusual punishment. How can you possibly expect me to choose between the two? So what are we waiting for? Yes, as suggested on the previous Versus Battle video back in November by the Warrior 8497, our next Bleach Versus Battle will be between two of Bleach's most talented, most intelligent, savvy, and above all else, tricky warriors. The current captain of the 1st Division and head captain of the Gotei 13, Yamamoto's prodigal son, Kyoraku Shunsui, and the former captain of the 12th Division turned humble candy store owner and the smartest man in Bleach, with an answer for absolutely everything, Kisuke Urahara. Now look, while I credited the Warrior 8497 with this pick, and their comment did receive the most upvotes, the reality is that Kyoraku vs Urahara was the most requested showdown by some margin on that last video, so obviously it had to be done. But still, these really are two of my favourite Bleach characters, and like I said, they are both incredibly unorthodox fighters in their own right. This is probably going to be considerably harder to determine, I think, than Aizen vs Urahara was. When I fired up that versus battle, I went into it with a fairly good idea that Urahara, even pre-Almighty, would come out on top. But this time, I think the perspective gap between the fighters is maybe smaller than ever before, and this will likely be decided by the thinnest of margins. Before we start though, I just want to say a huge thank you for the overwhelming and wonderful reception to that previous Versus battle. I'm so happy to have brought the series back, and it was so much fun devising a duel between Bleach's two biggest villains. So make sure to check that one out if you haven't done already. And again, once you're done with Kyoraku vs Urahara, make sure to let me know down in the comments which fight you want to be the subject of the next Versus Battle video. And again, the winner will be shouted out in the video to come. But without further ado, let's get on with this thing. I think it's going to be a long one. Holding my hands up, I think this is going to be really difficult to get right, to be completely honest, but I'll try my best as we tackle the showdown between Kyoraku Shunsui and Kisuke Urahara. Not only two of Bleach's most unconventional fighters, but yeah, two of the most popular as well. By the way, if you enjoyed today's video, consider helping out the channel by subscribing. It really would make a huge difference, especially as we're trying to reach 300,000 subs by the end of the year. So if you want to see more content just like this, then let me know by hitting that button. Again, it would make a massive difference. And check out my Patreon as well if you want to take that support from me another step further. It is the best place to go to help support the channel, especially when ad revenue on YouTube is a little hit and miss right now. There's no doubt about that. So taking that support from me over there as well, becoming a Patreon supporter, even for as little as $1 a month, makes a huge difference, and it is greatly appreciated. So I've already lamented how difficult I think this battle could be to determine, and the truth is that this might be a rare fight in Bleach where, ostensibly, we know everything there is to know about both of these combatants. Both Kyoraku and Kisuke have been involved in numerous fights throughout Bleach. Perhaps not as many as I would have liked, personally, but still, we've seen the extent of their abilities on display. They're both masters of the 4 Shinigami combat arts, and yes, we've seen both their Shikai and Bankai. In fact, in some ways, Kyoraku and Kisuke are more similar than they may first appear. Don't get me wrong, some of their similarities are fairly overt, but on a more meta level, I think the community holds them in very much the same regard. For example, the bankai of both of these characters were two of the single most anticipated reveals of the entire series, and by the time we learned what they were revealed to be two of the most busted abilities in all of Bleach, to the point where I'm already nervous about trying to integrate them both here. And yet at the same time, there are still so many unknown variables that could come into play to affect the fight's outcome one way or another. You know, there are plenty of Bleach characters for whom we are still missing vital information. Hell, we just saw in the previous Versus battle that we still don't know what Aizen's bankai is, or if he even has one at all, and so that could potentially add an entirely new layer to that fight were it ever to be revealed in the future. We could then revisit it and potentially change how things look. And the same is true here, on a slightly lesser scale, but more widespread. What does that mean? Well, for example, we've seen both Kyoraku's Shikai and Bankai, yes, but it's impossible to say whether or not we've seen everything he can do. For all we know, Katen Kyokotsu has a litany of additional children's games still available for use in future battles for when the time is right against opponents whom Kyoraku deems it necessary. For the most part, he uses totally different games when fighting Stark compared to when he battles Liege. And then there's his Bankai, which is even more nebulous. Sure, we see him use all 4 acts of one particular play in his fight against Liege, but considering he can almost certainly initiate a different play depending on what the situation demands, how do I even go about considering that in this fight with Kisuke? Now, to be fair, the 4 acts he initiated against Liege didn't seem tailor-made, in my opinion, to specifically bring that Stern Ritter down, save for the fact, of course, that Kyoraku was able to injure him thanks to Act 1 specifically, which worked as a loophole to get around Liege's intangibility, opening him up to the rest of the Bankai. But how do I account for Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju's potential depth in a battle with someone completely different, against whom the rules are completely different? The same is true when considering Kisuke and his battle prowess as well. When speaking of unknown variables, well, this is a character who was literally made a special war power by Urahara thanks to his unknown means, his resourcefulness as the Soul Society's world-class schemer. As Askin notes, the way the Quincy see him as is impossibly resourceful, and that no matter your plans, he will always outwit you. And that's something else that needs to be taken into account when trying to write a battle for this character. And this is going to crop up a lot throughout this video, but in many ways it can feel like Kisuke is Kubo's avatar. Someone who is privy to the story behind the scenes, and as a result can see and predict almost everything that's about to happen. In the Thousand Year Blood War arc, Kubo finally takes a moment to really break down what this means for Kisuke's character, actually baking it in to who he is, and we learn that he makes a near endless number of plans to try and prepare for every single eventuality when heading into battle. But it's more than just making the plans, it is the capacity to pull each and every one of them off near flawlessly and often in a split second. For example, when Yami attacked Kisuke from behind with a Bala Blast, not only was it a sneak attack, but it was performed at an incredible speed, 20 times faster than a Sero, thanks to the inherent quickness of Bala in general. Not only that, but Kisuke had never seen a Bala Blast before, save for the brief second when Wonderweiss tried to hit him a moment prior, and yet still, somehow, against all odds, all logic, Kisuke anticipates being struck from behind and sets up his portable Gigai in time. Not only that, but he actively asks Yami if he could tell when he made the switch. But of course he can't, because it seems like a physical impossibility on the surface. In that sense, Kisuke feels a little like a magician, pulling off completely unbelievable tricks that even the eye can't discern, and then not giving away his secrets, because that would break the illusion. More so than anyone else, the scientists in Bleach, Kisuke, Mayuri, are the characters with whom you have to suspend your disbelief, because they are routinely pulling off the impossible. And so yeah, this is gonna be tough. There's a lot going on behind the proverbial curtain, and the only way we're really gonna be able to judge this is by using everything we've seen in the manga to date, and coming to our own conclusion as best we can. So, first of all, let's take a deeper look at the 2 combatants of today's duel, and well, they do have a lot to offer. Make no mistake, Kyoraku Shunsui is one of the single most talented, powerful and well-rounded Shinigami within the Gotei 13 today. As one of the oldest living Shinigami and a surrogate son of Shigekuni Genryusai Yamamoto himself, Kyoraku is emblematic of the Gotei 13 both old and new, blending the two together to forge what is, in many ways, the ultimate warrior. Fusing the diligence, power, and authority of the old with a more unorthodox and less staunchly traditional belief of the new. In many ways, the easiest means of analysing Kyoraku's physical capabilities is to consider him something of a Yamamoto light. He's a master of all four of the Shinigami combat arts, yes, to a slightly lesser degree than his father figure, but still a master all the same. Where characters like Yamamoto and Aizen, as we mentioned in the last Versus battle, represent the very apex of the pure Shinigami, someone like Kyoraku handily occupies the next rung down. He's almost there, but not quite. Ironically, considering he rarely faces sword users in battle, Kyoraku's fighting style revolves around his immeasurable skill with the blade. Wielding two swords at once, Kyoraku's ambidextrous nature allows him to switch stances and hands on the fly, and combine Zanjutsu and Hakuda to deliver swift, immensely powerful strikes. By combining his own personal skill with Katen Kyokotsu's uniquely devastating abilities, Kyoraku fights in a challenging and unpredictable way, using whatever means necessary to score direct and often crippling hits. In his battle with Stark, Kyoraku's Kageoni dealt a fight-winning blow to the Espada, bursting through his back in such a savage and unexpected manner that Stark was never the same afterwards until the moment of his death. Combining the power of his Iro Oni with his own physical strength, Kyoraku finished the Espada off with a sword strike that obliterated the Irankar's body, breaking him in two. And later, in the skirmish against Aizen, Kyoraku was capable of cracking Aizen's Kido shield with a single swing of his Zanpakuto. In an all-encompassing show of his skill, Kyoraku is one of only two Shinigami, the other being Mayuri, to face down a member of Yhwach's Schutzstaffel completely on his own for the majority of the fight, and he succeeds in pushing the leader of the Schutzstaffel and Yhwach's chosen masterpiece Lige Barrow to use Volstendish, totally overwhelming the Sternritter in the first phase of their fight. And even after Lige's Volstendish makes him completely intangible, Kyoraku still manages to kill that form too, again completely on his own, before Lige's special godly privileges enable his survival against all odds. A transformation that I think we can all agree is inherently unfair, and that no regular Shinigami could defeat, no regular character could defeat. And yet the opening act of Kyoraku's fight with Lige is an excellent demonstration of how challenging it is to actually face the head captain in a 1v1 scenario, with Lige, who himself is a highly seasoned and skilled warrior, struggling to keep up with Kyoraku's deadly combination of speed, power, skill, and yes, a catalogue of abilities at the beck and call of his Zanpakuto. We don't see much from Kyoraku in the grand scheme of things, but he's shown to utilise Hardo 78 without an incantation, and of course is fast enough to dodge not only Stark's blade without messing up his outfit, which the Espada compliments him for, but also Lige's the X-Axis, which is a practically instantaneous attack. It's ironic, really, even though Kyoraku is technically overcome by Lige in the end, this is definitely the captain's most impressive showing by far, in my opinion. Just look at the damage he sustains. Kyoraku is shot by the X-Axis, which punches gigantic holes through its target without prejudice and cannot be blocked, so ostensibly Lige isn't shooting anything, his ability just removes everything on the X-Axis from existence. Through the foot, through the shoulder, through the side, and even eventually through the gut, and he keeps moving, dodging, fighting, and running where he can. Just before activating his bankai, Kyoraku is actively bleeding out all over the floor, and even he notes that not only can he not die from wounds like this, he can't even pass out, Despite this being, I would argue, one of the most severely injured we've ever seen a Shinigami at any one time, while they're still able to continue fighting. Obviously, someone like Mayuri suffers a considerably, in quotes, worse injury against Uryu, but he then exits the fight immediately afterwards. Kyoraku is forced into a box against Lige Ziliel and still manages to win the first and second rounds. Meanwhile, Kyoraku's Zanpakuto Katen Kyokotsu has proven itself to be almost unparalleled in how tricky, unpredictable, and yes, frankly broken it actually is. Kyoraku Shikai has the power to turn children's games into reality, and he has a seemingly endless list of games at his disposal. From Kageoni, which lets him hide in the shadows, attacking from underneath his opponent, to Iro Oni, trapping his enemy in a devastating, round-based, colour-picking death battle. Going further than that, Daruma Sangakoronda allows Kyoraku to teleport to his enemy's location, while Kageo Kuri effectively allows the captain to create limitless shadow clones of himself, so long as his opponent continues to mistake them for him. The list goes on, but the most crucial aspect of the Shikai is that although Kyoraku is ostensibly playing a game with his enemy, one in which they both need to know the rules, the truth will always be that Kyoraku has a massive inherent advantage. And as we see particularly against Lige, I think, he can quickly stagger and combine games to take control of the fight with ease, while even the most powerful and experienced of opponents have very little hope of keeping up. Then there's his bankai, Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju, which admittedly feels like something that's much tougher to pin down. His bankai turns the idea of play on its head, instead leading both Kyoraku and his target through a theatre production that tells a specific story, transforming the combatants into unwilling characters headed towards an inexorable fate. As far as we know, Kyoraku's bankai has potentially multiple plays it can use, perhaps even tailored to fit the specific situation. Was this play a tale of the lover's twin suicide beneath the withered pine tree, specifically tailored to combat Lige? It's hard to say, but I think it could have been. The sharing of the wounds, which when enacted kickstarts the entire bankai in this instance, was one of only a few ways, it seems, to get around the loophole of not being able to injure Lige. And then from that point onwards, the Stern Ritter was effectively done for. What I'm getting at is, would Kyoraku's bankai be able to come up with something to counter whatever Kisuke was doing in the moment? Or would it simply use this story again, seeing as, it looks like it would work absolutely fine on just about anyone else as well. So, we've got a fighter who was acknowledged by Yamamoto as being unmatched by his peers, someone who succeeded in killing the Primera Espada with only his Shikai, and after being recognised and promoted to the head captain, bested one of the strongest and most dangerous villains in Bleach, not once, but twice. But honestly, what makes Kyoraku truly scary is the way he layers his own unique personality and worldview atop all of that, and how he fights despite all of that. While the Shinigami are, generally speaking, supposed to embody the samurai, and the honourable values of said samurai traditions that permeate the rules of battle, Kyoraku doesn't adhere to that. Instead, we've got someone who's not only monstrously powerful and highly skilled, but a character who will do whatever it takes to win. To Kyoraku, fighting isn't honourable. Despite Kyoraku saving their lives, Love admonishes him for butting into their fight against Stark, but Kyoraku tells him that only losers focus too much on means and lose sight of winning. Captains don't have that luxury. He then instructs the Vizard that they shouldn't try to act like good boys. Someone may owe you, or you may owe someone, but the moment you start a war, you're both evil. Essentially saying that people concoct all kinds of reasons and excuses for starting a fight, but once the fight begins, it is just something that exists to be won. There's no honour or good to be found there. It's crucial to note that Kyoraku gives this lecture while flicking the blood from his sword. At the end of the day, he's taken a life. Winning was all that mattered, but he doesn't feel good about it. It's this mentality that ultimately makes him so incredibly dangerous. Where other captains and Shinigami are honourable and predictable, Kyoraku has no qualms with exploiting a weakness and stabbing someone in the back. In fact, his entire fighting style revolves around it. While the Gotei 13 is morally grey as an organisation on the whole, morality does play a large part in how they fight, often not wanting to step on each other's toes, choosing to fight honourably, and only battling enemies 1v1 where they can. Even Kyoraku adheres to that to some degree, wondering whether it's right for Ukitake to join him on the battlefield against Stark, with Ukitake justifying it by claiming that Stark and Lilanet are technically two people now that they've fused together. But as we can see against Stark in particular, the Espada was absolutely cruising along against the Vizard and only lost and ultimately died because Kyoraku took a chance to blindside him. And, well, who was left standing in the end? Is it fighting dirty? Is it unfair? Perhaps. But again, that's the kind of argument that Kyoraku scoffs at, and it's what makes him so interesting. The cherry on top of all of this is that Kyoraku is one of the wisest, smartest, and most perceptive characters in the entire series. Strategic and cunning, and constantly able to adapt to the flow of battle. He's going to be an immensely difficult opponent for pretty much any single person to defeat in a straightforward one-on-one duel. So what about the guy that he's up against? What do we know about him? To be honest, he doesn't seem like he's going to be all that. After all, he's just a humble candy store owner. Look, what is there to really say about Kisuke Urahara that hasn't already been said? In many ways, this is the man who has it all when it comes to combat. As the former captain of the 12th Division, and perhaps even more importantly, a former unit commander of the Omnitz Kido, Kisuke is a man of many talents and an exceptionally skilled fighter in every single way. Like Kyoraku before him, Kisuke sadly isn't the recipient of too many actual fights in the series itself, but despite this, he still manages to convey a genuine sense of power and control in battle at every turn, and is a proven master of all four of the Shinigami combat arts again, having worked his way up through and been intimately ingrained within the shadowy special ops, perhaps the most combat and skill-oriented branch of the entire military, an immensely demanding role which has shaped, honed, and disciplined Kisuke forevermore, despite how his exterior demeanour may seem. As a result, he arguably shows a greater discipline of the arts than even Kyoraku previously. So let's start with those combat arts. Kisuke is a master swordsman, pressuring Ichigo during his training with barely any effort whatsoever, before completely overwhelming the boy to the point where he was actively dismantling and destroying Ichigo's sword in the process. Against more dangerous foes, Kisuke has proven to be, again, almost unstoppable. Against Yami, Kisuke neutralizes the Espada's attack with a flick of his wrist, while against Aizen, Kisuke combined swordplay with additional tools and tricks to exploit the villain's reckless behavior, ensnaring Aizen in multiple traps with ease. Much later against Askin, Kisuke blitzes the Stern Ritter with sheer speed and carves through his shoulder with his sealed sword, albeit while using bankai. Speaking of which, something has to be said of the fact that Kisuke, using his own invention, the Tenshin Tai, was capable of forcing Benihime to submit in just 3 days. The only other person who managed such a feat was none other than Ichigo himself, which speaks volumes of the caliber of person required to be able to accomplish such a feat. In my opinion, this says a lot of Kisuke's immeasurable skill, but also of his unmatched resolve, determination, and yes, ambition. When it comes to speed, Kisuke is again a true master. As shown in the manga, he is so fast that he's capable of switching himself out with his portable Gigai in the blink of an eye, and so quickly that his enemy doesn't notice. Not only does he achieve this against Yami, but later against even Aizen himself too. When Wonder Weiss jumps Kisuke out of nowhere, the shopkeeper is able to react quick enough to counter, and twists on the spot with enough speed and dexterity to unleash a wave of energy at the oncoming Ranka, dispelling the threat in an instant. Again, in the battle against Askin, who, especially in the anime, is being built up to be one of the fastest Sternritter, Kisuke can not only keep up with the Quincy, he can overwhelm him. His immense speed comes as a result of his time again in the Omnitz Kido. And that's not all. While he may not look like a physical powerhouse, Kisuke is a Hakuda master, with enough strength and skill to totally subdue every single prisoner in the Maggot's Nest completely unarmed. But then of course there's Kisuke's proficiency with Kido. Kisuke is an unmitigated master of magic, and one of the Soul Society's greatest spellcasters. In fact, he's up there with the likes of Aizen as being almost unparalleled in their skill with the craft, with presumably only the likes of Tessai and Hachi outmatching them, but even then I doubt there's too much in it based on what we've seen from Kisuke to date. The shopkeeper rapidly casts numerous high-level Kido in quick succession, all without an incantation, and is even capable of wielding 90s level Hardo with complete control and effectiveness. Not only that, but Kisuke is an expert at creating brand new Kido magic too, a level of Kido expertise and control that we really only see from very few characters. Forging multiple spells with the specific intention of defeating a transcendent Aizen, including a seal designed to shut off Aizen's Reiatsu vents on his wrists, burning him up from the inside. A move that Aizen himself admits would have won Kisuke the battle outright had he not already subdued the Hogyoku. I mean, that right there tells you everything. The Gote 13 had been struggling to even land a hit on Aizen, yet in the same chapter that Kisuke joins the fight, he would have successfully killed the villain, were it not for the Hogyoku, achieving what the Gote 13 couldn't across at least a volume's worth of content in the span of a single chapter. Let that sink in. In the end as well, it's ultimately Kisuke's bespoke Kido spell seal that imprisons Aizen once Ichigo weakens him with Mugetsu. Look, let's just cut to the chase and get to why we're all really here. I could list Kisuke's achievements for a long time, but the reality is it's his intellect that separates him from the rest of the pack. Kisuke is the single smartest character in the entire series, and that counts for a lot in the world of Bleach. When discussing intelligence in Bleach, we really have to put ourselves in the position of its creator, Kubo himself. Because characters rarely feel more like a proxy for the author than those who are super intelligent. And the reason for that is simple. In order for them to work, the ultra-smart archetypes get an almost meta-level, almost omniscient perspective of the world, story, and events unfolding that other characters don't, that other characters can't. It's something of a paradox. When it comes to writing from a third-party perspective, the characters that you want to come across as hyper-intelligent must tap into the unbelievable in order to be believable. And Kisuke does just that in the craziest sense of the word. Kisuke's unfettered intelligence allows him to achieve almost anything within the bounds of the story. Aizen is going to fuse with the Hogyoku and transform into an unstoppable divine being. Kisuke has not only predicted that, but he's devised a plan to seal his enemy away. Askin's the death dealing will go haywire upon his own death and take Kisuke down with him. Kisuke has not only foreseen that event, but he's prepared for it too and ensured his escape. The captains have had their bankai stolen. Kisuke will figure out a way to get them back. While Kisuke doesn't go to the lengths Mayuri does in regards to modifying his own body, he counters his enemies in a different way, often using tools and deception to get ahead. Yami seemingly scores a hit on Kisuke from behind, coming out of nowhere and completely surprising the man. Nope, it was just a decoy, an inflatable Gigai that Kisuke had apparently switched out with just in time, and in such a way that Yami could never have known. Truthfully, switching with the portable Gigai like that should be impossible. It's very similar to Mayuri replacing every organ in his body prior to fighting Xyloporo. It shouldn't be doable. But they manage it anyway, and we don't question it because that's who they are. Again, that's what comes with these scientist-type characters. Askin has poisoned Yoroichi, rendering her unable to move. Well, Kisuke has whipped up an immunity booster that enables her to keep fighting, having been able to do so while hiding and listening to their conversation. So this man is literally creating counters to broken abilities on the fly. And this idea of being capable of anything extends to his Zanpakuto, Benihime. While Benihime might not seem as overtly dangerous and tricky to deal with as Katen Kyokotsu on the outside, the truth is that this is one of the most versatile and incredible weapons in all of Bleach. Benihime represents the power of creation, or the ability to create, allowing Kisuke to, well, make whatever he wants, and his bankai, Kanon Biraki Benihime Aratame, extends that ability to everything in Kisuke's vicinity, and perhaps even beyond, allowing him to remake the world and those in it as he sees fit. From simple energy blasts to complex structures and constructs, Kisuke can use Benihime in an endless number of ways. The Zanpakuto is one of, if not probably the single, most versatile in the entire series, reflecting its owner's dedication to planning for every single eventuality. Offensively, aside from launching waves of crimson energy, Benihime has been shown to be capable of unleashing a net of reishi that binds Kisuke's opponents before then combining said net with explosive orbs to create an entirely separate ability that then detonates in a violent column of fire. Whereas defensively, Benihime can conjure a red shield of reishi strong enough to block Yami's fist with ease, and the first uncontrolled release of Ichigo's Getsuga Tensho, which Kisuke believed would have taken his arm off, were it not for the shield. Meanwhile, his bankai conjures an enormous wooden puppet in the form of Benihime herself, which looms over him in a protective embrace. Benihime has the power to restructure anything she touches, and this ability materializes in the form of stitches and string that Kisuke uses to dissect and reassemble freely on the battlefield. Benihime's bankai takes the free-form versatility of its Shikai's creation abilities to the absolute next level. Now, Kisuke can heal himself to the point of completely restoring his destroyed eyes in a matter of seconds, and in the midst of battle he can restructure his own limbs to physically empower them, allowing him to suddenly send Askin flying. Speaking of Askin, Kisuke can split his enemy's own body open, though only so long as the target remains in range of his bankai. That being said, Kisuke is also capable of restructuring the very landscape around him, allowing Grimjo to essentially teleport across Varvelt via a restructured tunnel. While this is all we've seen the bankai do for now, and it's a lot considering the bankai is barely around for a chapter, it certainly seems to be essentially limitless in what it can do, in how it can help out Kisuke in the midst of a fight. So, yeah, that's Kisuke, and it really does look as though he's gonna put up a hell of a fight against Kyoraku, though as I said at the start of this video, this is maybe the toughest battle I've looked at so far. Normally when I get to work on these versus battle videos, it is fairly clear, like I said at the start, who is going to win from the get-go. With Yamamoto versus Ichibei, although Yamamoto is a monster, I was always fairly convinced Ichibei would win. The same goes for Ulquiorra versus Asnod and Aizen versus Yhwach. Really, the only other fight that I wasn't sure about was Lige versus Gerard, and it's true here as well. But regardless, let's take a look at how their fight might play out, and who ends up the ultimate victor in the end. So is there anything else we need to consider as we go into this battle? Look, the truth is that Kisuke almost certainly knows what Kyoraku Shikai is capable of, and that's important because, as mentioned earlier, Kyoraku always goes into his fights with a certain level of inherent advantage in regards to his Shikai's games, but his bankai? I'm actually less convinced by that. In fact, I'm not certain either character really knows what the other's bankai can do. The reason I say this is because the Vandenreich has been watching the Soul Society for over 1,000 years, and has studiously collected data on absolutely everything they can do. But both Lige and Askin state that they don't have any data on their respective opponent's bankai. Kisuke even replies to Askin, saying he's never used it in front of anyone here, which is slightly weird phrasing. Askin even laments that explains it, but how? Presumably when Kisuke says anyone here, he means everyone. I mean, that's the only way it makes sense. No one has seen it for 1,000 years in the Soul Society. Even then, I'm not sure it does make sense, as there's no way Kisuke hasn't demonstrated his bankai at least once, even if only to Yoruichi to prove to her he's ready for the commendation over 100 years ago. I guess it's possible the Vandenreich missed it at the time, but I'd have thought they would have had eyes on every captain at all times, at the very least. In fact, I just checked, and in the Viz translation, Kisuke says, "those who are here right now," which makes even less sense, to be totally honest, unless again, when he says here right now, he means the wider battle as a whole. I mean, this is Kisuke we're talking about, so if anyone understands the scope of what the Vandenreich should and shouldn't know, I guess it would be him. Either way, what's important is if the Vandenreich doesn't have any information on these two bankai, then I'd say there's a decent chance that neither combatant in today's battle knows what the other can do either. Except for one throwaway line that comes about early in the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. In chapter 516, as Mayuri details to Ichigo the consequences of a broken bankai, he reveals that he has studied every single officer's bankai for his research, even going so far as to show what looks to be a detailed list of them all on his computer screen, which feels like a bit of a tease on Kubo's part. Like Ukitake's bankai is probably there, for example, maybe even Isshin's, maybe Love's, maybe even Aizen if he has one. They're all there potentially, but either way, I'm not saying this means Kisuke has to know what Kyoraku's bankai can do, but frankly, if Mayuri knows, I absolutely wouldn't be surprised if Kisuke knows too. In fact, I would be more surprised if he didn't. And this is what I mean though by this all being a bit weird. If Mayuri somehow knows what Kyoraku's bankai is, if he has data on what it can do, then he must have at least revealed it at some point. Mayuri must have been in a position to see it at some point, but then why don't the Vandenreich know what it can do? Honestly, how much the other knows about their capabilities is perhaps going to be the most vital point here today, because both of these fighters like to use the element of surprise to their advantage. Ultimately, Kisuke is going to know more than Kyoraku coming into this battle. There's no way around it. Kyoraku has never been the type of character to need to know absolutely everything there is. But instead, he reads the situation and adapts in real time to whatever he's confronted with. And, to be completely fair, he's not fighting Liege Barrow here. Kisuke isn't an opponent upon whom swords literally won't work. In that sense, it should be a more straightforward battle, but, well, we know it won't be. To make things easier for ourselves, let's say both fighters are going into this battle with an understanding of what the other can do, from Shikai to Bankai and beyond. That doesn't mean they aren't capable of pulling out surprises. The portable Gigai, for example, might show up, but in regards to their Shinigami limits, both sides are fairly well informed. The real question, the question that will likely define the outcome of this duel, is has Kisuke prepared for every single one of Kyoraku's games, and is that even possible? We know Kisuke tries to prepare for all possible outcomes, and so he likely has an answer to every single game that we've ever seen. And when I ask how realistic that is, that's when it comes back around to this idea of Kisuke practically feeling like a Kubo surrogate, and so asking if something is realistic or possible when it comes to Kisuke is somewhat pointless. Technically, from his perspective, everything is. Look, ultimately, I think it's easy to fall into the trap of overrating Kisuke's resourcefulness, even though it earned him a spot as a special war power, and I want to try and avoid doing that, but I think it's going to be tough. And let's not forget that from a pure ability perspective, I would argue Kyoraku has the upper hand going into this fight. Speaking of which, for some context, let's imagine that sometime after the war, Kyoraku, the head captain of the Gotei 13, approaches Kisuke with a proposal. In the wake of Xyloporo's appearance in the human world and the phosphoplasm of hell manifesting in the Serete, Kyoraku wants to put his skills to the test. Kisuke thinks it's unnecessary, but in secret, Kyoraku is readying himself for what he believes is an inevitable showdown against his former friends and colleagues Urahara and Ukitake, and of course, his father figure Yamamoto. As it's the head captain asking, and considering Kisuke's relations with the Gotei 13 are currently stronger than ever since his exile, he obliges him, though warns the head captain once more that his bankai isn't really suited for training people, in a joking way of course. Now interestingly, this potential setup for a battle, which I always like to try and make as realistic as possible, is maybe going to put Kyoraku at a disadvantage as he's not fighting to kill. I mean, he kind of can be, I guess, aware that the 4th Division could probably heal whatever is necessary when he's done with Kisuke, but Kyoraku's underhanded fighting style, his darker, sinister personality, that really comes into play when he's fighting to kill. So maybe that's going to hurt him here. Now, before the fight begins, Kyoraku wonders aloud if they're alone. When Kisuke questions what he means, the head captain simply mutters that he can sense an unusual reiatsu in the air, but shrugs it off, pulling his straw hat down over his eyes and mumbling under his breath that whatever is afoot will likely show itself organically in time. To that end, Kyoraku makes the first move, vanishing and reappearing directly in front of Kisuke. The head captain appears to ready himself to strike with one of his swords, but suspecting a trap right off the bat, Kisuke leaps backwards into the air, keeping his eyes on his enemy at all times. Rather than use an ability, Kyoraku uses Shunpo a second time, this time appearing behind Kisuke and trying to impale him, while leaving what looks to be an afterimage of sorts down on the ground. Although Kisuke thinks about turning around to block the strike, he instead activates a small Kido shield at the back of his neck, something he learned from Aizen, to block Kyoraku's oncoming sword, all the while keeping his eyes locked on the afterimage below, using his understanding of Kyoraku's games, or the games that we've seen anyway. Kyoraku's blade makes contact with the shield, but instead of cracking the Kido, Kyoraku himself vanishes into smoke. It turns out that the Kyoraku who appeared behind Kisuke was the afterimage, while the real Kyoraku remained on the ground, hoping to trick Kisuke into looking away from him, thus ensnaring him in Kageokuri, but to no avail. As Kisuke counters by releasing Benehime and slinging an arc of crimson energy down to the ground below, Kyoraku leaps out of the way, complimenting Kisuke on seeing through the tricky nature of his shadows. Kisuke responds by noting that he decided to fight this battle while expecting the unexpected at all times. Adapting on the fly, Kyoraku decides to forego the games for a moment, in an attempt to lure Kisuke into a false sense of security, or at least that's how it looks on the surface. Instead, the head captain bears down upon Kisuke with his scimitars and the two clash, sending sparks flying. Kyoraku's swordsmanship is virtually unparalleled, and Kisuke finds himself on the back foot again, watching as Kyoraku switches hands and stances in the midst of his dance-like flow. Attempting to break Kyoraku's advantage, Kisuke deflects one of Katen Kyokotsu's blades with Benehime before twisting round and planting a hefty kick upon the second sword, pushing Kyoraku's arms apart and leaving him wide open. Taking advantage and rushing forwards, Kisuke places his outstretched hand almost directly upon Kyoraku's exposed chest and unleashes Hado 63, Raikoho, blasting a cannon of electricity through the head captain. Except Kyoraku manages to escape at the last minute, just as the bolt of yellow energy explodes across the skyline, illuminating the battlefield. Kisuke watches as the light flashes momentarily, taking a look at the ground around them, noticing that for a mere second or so, whatever shadows, whatever darkness is around them, subside for a brief second. Kyoraku meanwhile laments that Kisuke is a difficult man to get any attacks off against, while Kisuke smirks, understanding fully well that Kyoraku has barely begun to take the fight seriously. Still, Kisuke readies a volley of Kido, attempting to use Rikujo Koro to stop the head captain in his tracks. In response, Kyoraku uses Bushogoma, slinging a vortex of wind into the sky in an attempt to disrupt Kisuke's Kido and his eyeline. In a second, Kisuke disengages his spell and cuts through the torrent of wind, but Kyoraku is right in front of him, and the head captain brings his sword down in a huge arc. At the last second, Kisuke uses Benehime to conjure his blood mist shield, and Kyoraku's blade carves into the ability, cracking it like glass. Suddenly, however, Benehime's shield begins to rebuild itself on top of Kyoraku's blade, coating the scimitar in a strange crimson wax-like substance, with the Captain Commander realizing in shock that he can no longer retrieve his sword. Kisuke explains that he's been trying to lure Kyoraku in close enough to where he can rob him of one of his blades for a while, throwing back the curtain as he reveals he's quietly augmenting the blood mist shield with the properties of Bakudo 37 Suriboshi, weaving them together with Bakudo 63 Sajo Sabaku. Kyoraku compliments Kisuke on his unorthodox usage of Suriboshi, turning its elastic-like makeup into a weapon. The head captain muses that the ability to use a Bakudo in an offensive manner is exactly what he'd expect from proficient Kido users like Kisuke and Nanao. Having lost one of his swords, Kyoraku appears to be in trouble. Kisuke, retrieving the stolen scimitar from his Zanpakuto and Kido cocktail, drops back down to the floor again, when suddenly a black blade bursts forth from his chest. Looking around in horror, Kisuke watches as Kyoraku emerges from his shadow on the ground, having used Kageoni to impale the former captain. Kyoraku muses that to use Kageoni he only really needs the one blade, but that doesn't mean he's planning on letting Kisuke borrow the other one. However, as Kisuke chokes on blood, his body rapidly inflates before bursting, revealing yet another ruse as the stolen Zanpakuto clatters upon the ground. The real Kisuke comes flying down from the sky, Benehime raised above his head. Kyoraku is quick to pick up his weapon, but he's in a vulnerable spot. The head captain manages to block Kisuke's downward arc with just the one sword, but the ground cracks and breaks beneath him as he's forced back. Kisuke rapidly slashes away at Kyoraku's scimitar, but the head captain is capable of maneuvering his second blade out to the side and swings it upwards in a violent strike, watching as Kisuke flings himself backwards and out of the way. Kyoraku muses that the inflatable Gigai is a nice little move, and Kisuke thanks him, offering to engineer some for the Gotei 13 if they're willing to pay him enough. Smirking, replying that they might be able to work something out, though only if Kisuke is willing to step on Mayuri's toes to do so, Kyoraku unleashes his next game, Iro Oni. The two lock blades again, with Kyoraku lightly demonstrating Iro Oni by calling out the colour straw, and successfully striking Kisuke on the shoulder. Although it feels like a hefty cut, Kisuke notes that he isn't wounded at all. Exactly as the notes from Kyoraku's duel with Stark pertained, with Iro only allowing the attacker to cut the colour they actually called. And since Kisuke has no straw on him, or at least not where Kyoraku cut, he isn't injured. Kyoraku smirks as Kisuke takes his turn, calling out the colour green. Although Kisuke is covered in green, Kyoraku doesn't have any green on him, and so the injury Kyoraku takes to his own arm is nullified as well. Kyoraku appears disappointed, and a little surprised even, that someone of Kisuke's caliber doesn't seem to fully grasp the concept of the game. Having given Kisuke a sporting chance, Kyoraku rushes in and the two clash again, sending a volley of sparks rising into the sky. As they back off from one another, Kyoraku whips his pink Hayori from his shoulders and tosses both it and his straw hat to the ground. Lunging for Kisuke again, Kyoraku calls out his next turn, black. Although he's still wearing his white captain's Hayori, it's still a good call, and Kisuke correctly guesses what's about to happen next. Before Kyoraku brings his blade round like a pendulum, the head captain also removes his Hayori as well, now wearing only black, the same technique that ultimately defeated Stark, as he did the same thing to amplify the power of the colour he was cutting with his final Iro Oni strike there as well. With Kisuke's own Hayori also being black, it looks like the fight is over. However, Kisuke draws his Shikai in front of him, preparing a response. Before he can do so, though, the Kyoraku in front of him evaporates into smoke. The head captain never deactivated Kage Okuri from the start of the battle, and Kisuke has taken his eyes off the captain numerous times at this point. As such, the real Kyoraku appears behind Kisuke, bringing his blade roaring downwards in a gigantic arc. Although he prepares himself for the possibility of a second inflatable Gigai, Kyoraku moves to end the battle with one strike. Instead, strangely, Kisuke doesn't move at all. He barely seems to anticipate the hit. when suddenly the former captain tears his own Hayori from his shoulders and tosses it aside, just as Kyoraku's blade buries itself into his shoulder. Now that Kisuke doesn't have a speck of black on him, the damage is mitigated. It's still a hefty blow, and as per the rules of the game, as he did have black on his person when Kyoraku called his colour, blood still ruptures from the wound. And as we saw when Kyoraku killed Stark, the parameters of Iro Oni are flexible. So Kisuke is still injured, as in a sense he's cheated the outcome of the game, but it's not the fight winner that Kyoraku had planned it to be. Instead, Kisuke calculated that allowing himself to take the weakened hit was more beneficial, and having prepared his Shikai earlier, Kisuke unleashes Shibari Benehime, tying up Kyoraku's sword in a black and crimson reishi net that emerges like a stringy liquid from the Zanpaku toe. When an admittedly impressed Kyoraku reminds Kisuke that he needs only one sword and only one shadow, Kisuke suddenly reveals a small canister from within the folds of his Shihakusho. The real Kyoraku once again bursts up from the ground behind Kisuke, preparing to impale him with Kageoni. However, the scientist notes that he's glad to have taken some inspiration from Mayuri's countering of the Quincy shadows, and he launches the canister into the air. With a whir, the canister explodes with a powerful light, completely drenching the battlefield in a near-blinding glow. The all-encompassing light eradicates every shadow from the battlefield, forcibly ejecting Kyoraku from Kageoni before he can make contact. With the head captain caught in mid-air, Kisuke turns and slashes him successfully across the chest. Although he takes a hefty hit, Kyoraku adapts to the situation, and having been catapulted upwards by the light, he changes games in mid-air and unleashes Taka Oni, bringing his blade down upon Kisuke, carving into the man's shoulder once again, before retrieving his lost blade. The two fighters skid backwards away from each other, with Kyoraku lamenting that Kisuke really does have an answer for everything up his sleeve, or in this case, in his Shakusho. With the grenade still emitting an incredible light as it hangs in mid-air, whatever shadow games Kyoraku had planned are now useless. Realizing that he's running low on options, Kyoraku admonishes Kisuke for continually trying to steal his swords. The former captain laughs, before relenting that it's only because he knows what Kyoraku can do with them. The head captain smiles to himself, before bringing out both blades in front of him. Although Kisuke hasn't necessarily seen the stance before, he anticipates what's coming, and Kyoraku releases his bankai, Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju. At this point, there are a couple of routes the fight can now take, though if I'm being honest, I think we ultimately end up at the same place no matter what. We have no choice but to use the only theatre play of Kyoraku's that we've actually seen. I can't just make one up, and some abilities to go with it. So we have to once again assume that he's going to ensnare Kisuke in the same story of the lover's twin suicide under the withered pine tree. And that gives us some options. Again, we're assuming that Kisuke knows what the bankai can do. But even if he doesn't, again, I don't think the finale here is likely to change too much. But still, as we move into the end game, I want to look at some possible scenarios for how this duel could come to a close. Firstly, if Kisuke goes into the battle knowing what Kyoraku's bankai can do and how it works, this is the easiest win situation for Kisuke overall. At the start of the battle, Kyoraku speculated that they weren't alone, that someone else was there with them, due to the strange Reiatsu permeating the air. Here, just as he releases his bankai, he feels that same sensation again, and is shocked when nothing happens. Although the same pattern of the pine tree spreads across the ground, and the walls of the kabuki theatre rise up around the two fighters, the bankai progresses no further. When Kyoraku is confused as to what's going on, he looks down at the wounds he's sustained in the battle so far, only to find that they've been sewn up. And the same goes for Kisuke's as well. It's here that Kisuke reveals his ultimate trump card. He's had his bankai, Kanonbiraki Benehime Aratame, active since their duel began, and had cloaked its existence with the Kido spell Kyoko, having first sealed his bankai within a barrier, before then combining said barrier with the invisibility spell, aware that Kanonbiraki Benehime Aratame could still affect Kyoraku so long as he remained in its range. As the Kido spells disintegrate, and with the enormous wooden doll revealed, Kisuke explains that he knows the first act of Kyoraku's bankai is only triggered if the combatants have wounds that can be shared among them, and he used his bankai to quickly restructure their bodies, thereby halting the activation of the bankai in its tracks. Kyoraku can do nothing but applaud the man, smirking at a battle well fought, amazed at the former captain's ability to prepare so far in advance. But Kisuke confesses that the only reason he thought to have his bankai ready for their battle ahead of time was because Kyoraku was the level of opponent who required such preparation, noting that Benehime's Shikai alone was never going to be enough. Kisuke suddenly coughs up blood and notes how his arms and legs are shaking from the strain of managing both his barrier and his Kyoko and his bankai all while fighting Kyoraku. However, with Kyoraku beaten at his own game, the curtain is drawn on this fight. Now, how you guys feel about this ending is obviously entirely up to you, and of course I am taking creative liberties here, but really there's no way not to, since these are two bankai that we've never seen interacting before, and I'm just going off what we have seen from them individually in the manga. In my opinion, this is a scenario that would work, it would feasibly play out like this, so I don't see any reason why it couldn't, but of course, as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And earlier I mentioned that I wanted to look at various different scenarios, but the reality is, if it comes down to both characters using their bankai, I still think Kisuke is likely to win. Taking a step back, it's clear to me that these two fighters are extremely evenly matched in almost every way. Kisuke's resourcefulness gives him a somewhat narrative-bending advantage, as seen when I had him utilise essentially a flashbang grenade of sorts to counter Kyoraku's shadows. But who is going to complain that Kisuke would have such an item on him just in case? That's how the character is written, and has been written historically, and that's what will always give him an edge in these scenarios. Unless he's massively outmatched in raw power, as was the case against Aizen, I can't help but feel that Kisuke will always come out on top in the end, as Kubo essentially spelled out for us at the end of his duel with Askin. And even then, Kisuke saw far enough ahead to defeat Aizen in the end. That being said, in a contest of just their Shikai and their raw swordsmanship skill, I think Kyoraku is likely to be the winner. Katen Kyokotsu is so overbearing, so overwhelming, and so difficult to fight against that I just think he's ultimately going to be the victor. However, while Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju is also itself ridiculously broken, and seemingly traps its combatants into a guaranteed death loop, in my opinion, Kisuke's bankai is just that much more broken. At the very least, Kyoraku's bankai seems to have to follow set rules, a set flow of sorts, a narrative. Whereas Kisuke's bankai is completely freeform, he writes the narrative. Am I overrating Canon Biraki Benehime Aratame here? I'm not sure, it's totally possible, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it down below. But as far as I'm concerned, we've not seen anything from this bankai to suggest its essentially reality-warping powers wouldn't be able to interfere with other bankai too, especially one that seems to be more rigid and on a set path, like Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju is. If, for example, Kisuke already knows that Act 4 is coming, that his throat might be cut, who's to say he can't stitch his throat up to resist said attack? I don't know, maybe this is all getting a bit ridiculous at this point, and maybe you do disagree. But then there's also Kisuke's demeanour to contend with as well, which may well be his biggest advantage when faced with this particular bankai, especially if he knows what to do ahead of time. You see, Liege was almost the perfect enemy to face Katen Kyokotsu Karamatsu Shinju because he was highly strung, arrogant, and like a lot of Quincy, clearly didn't really understand the Shinigami to the fullest extent, certainly beyond the limits of Yhwach's Daten, and was terrified of what he was facing, even if he tried not to show it. Kisuke is the complete opposite, of course, in almost every way. Even if he was wounded by Act 1, I have a hard time imagining he would find himself affected by Acts 2 and 3. And we also don't know what the trigger is for Act 4, if there even is one. See, I always thought Act 4 was triggered by the opponent losing their resolve, meaning in the story, Their cowardice, the character's cowardice, was met with death. And we see that by Lige both trying to escape and then trying to foolishly rush Kyoraku. Again, I just don't see a reality where Kisuke succumbs to either of these outcomes. Look, things would certainly be different, however, if he didn't know what the bankai could do ahead of time. In that scenario, it's totally possible that Kyoraku could win, as his bankai does seem to be in many cases a guaranteed win condition, but again, considering Mayuri has data on every single bankai, trying to look at this as objectively as possible, from the most realistic perspective as possible, I think the greater likelihood is that Kisuke knows what Kyoraku can do. And that's why I went with that particular route. And so as we finally reach the long-awaited verdict on this frankly almost impossible battle to dictate, I have to give the win to the former captain of the 12th Division, but these days just a humble candy store owner, Kisuke Urahara. Again, it is not an easy win, and it's not an easy decision to make. Kyoraku matches him in nearly every facet, and exceeds him in some. Again, strip away Kisuke's meta-level, almost godlike ability to anticipate a battle and focus in on only the Shikai, and I think Kyoraku takes it. But that's a lot of concessions. You can't strip away Kisuke's intelligence because that's who he is. He's just a totally different beast. And then you include his bankai in that as well, and I think you're dealing with a whole different ballgame. The only people who are defeating Kisuke in an outright battle at that point, in my opinion, are essentially those who are transcendent. Your Ichigos, your Aizens, the likes of Ichibei and Yhwach. Otherwise, Kisuke is likely to have an answer to whatever comes his way. And even then, as we saw with Aizen, a character who does outmatch him in almost every way, he might still have an answer. As we saw in this fight today too, Kisuke plays the long game, and ends up getting the last laugh on his opponent. But again, that's not to disparage Kyoraku. This is a man who is essentially on that same pedestal, as seen by the way he took Lige down, not once, but twice, all on his own. That kind of prowess in battle shouldn't be overlooked. But when you're dealing with what feels like an avatar of the writer himself, in many cases, it is always going to be an uphill battle. Alright everyone, but that's it for the latest Bleach versus battle. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Do you agree with my take on who the winner would be? Who do you think would win between Kyoraku Shunsui and Kisuke Urahara? Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments, how you think their Shikai would play against each other, how their Bankai would play against each other, how Kisuke's intelligence would factor in, how Kyoraku's underhandedness would factor in. I'd love to read all of your comments. And speaking of comments, like I said, let me know which battle you would like to see next. Whichever one gets the most upvotes is going to be the next Bleach versus battle. So do please leave your choices down in the comments below and let's decide who the next versus battle will be. Thanks again for watching everyone. Remember to hit subscribe if you enjoyed today's video. If you want to see more videos just like this and help push us to 300,000 subs, I really would appreciate it. And if you liked this video a lot, I mean an awful lot, consider taking that support for the channel another step further by supporting it over on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Your support on Patreon is absolutely vital, and it really does help the channel so very much, just like everyone here is doing. Thank you to each and every one of you again for your support of the channel, including all of the new Patreon supporters. It does mean absolutely everything. So again, thank you all so very much. Alright guys, but until next time, I'm going to get out of here before my voice completely deteriorates. So until then, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.